lovely people, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel if you've just joined us. My name is Nell, and before we get into today's video, I just wanted to go ahead and do a few quick shout outs for people. These are Parks with PJ, Jared King TV, Queen Laura TV, Love to Investigate, Outghosted, Warhorse Films, Bravehearts Videos, and Naomi's Adventures. Guys, these YouTubers have some fantastic content on their channels. Some of them, like me, haven't long started doing regular videos, and honestly, they absolutely deserve all the support, all the love. These are some of the loveliest people who I've had the opportunity to meet through this so far, and honestly the support that they give is just astounding. They totally deserve more love, so go ahead, go check them out. I will leave the links to their channels in the description box below after this video. Go ahead, go show them some love. They honestly deserve it. Yeah. With that said, grab a drink, dim the lights, and let's get into today's video. So in about 1904, a doll was gifted to a young boy by the name of Robert Eugene Otto, or Gene, and it's kind of unclear as to who exactly gave him this doll. Some people say that it was gifted to him by a relative or family member. Others say it was given to him from a servant of the household. It's not really clear which one of it is, but either way, the doll came into Robert's life in about 1904 when he was about 4 years old. And first of all, things were absolutely fine, and in fact the two of them were quite inseparable from the get-go. Robert was to take the doll with him everywhere he went. He would even go as far as to ask for a place for him to be set at the table, so he could sit with Robert and the family at meal times, and even went so far as to start dressing the doll in his own clothes. In fact, the little blue and white sailor suit that he's seen in today is said to have come from Robert Eugene Otto himself. And at first his family found all this quite endearing, you know. He was just a young child, very attached to this doll, and it seemed to bring him a lot of comfort and solace, because from what I understand, although he had siblings, they were quite far in age from him. They were quite a bit older, and so I think he'd most likely feel quite left out of their older games. So the way his parents saw it is that, you know, it was nice for him to have a sort of companion, as it were. So for a few weeks everything was fine, things carried on as normal, until one day Robert came downstairs and told his parents that the doll in fact wished to be called Robert, and as a result he would not be sharing his name, and so the doll would be called Robert, and the boy answered only to his surname, Eugene or Gene, which this would continue all the way through the rest of his life. Even when he was a famous artist, he would only be known as Gene. And from then on, things started taking on a bit of a strange turn for the family. They would often hear Gene talking to Robert in another room, which, you know, would be a perfectly normal thing for a child to do. But then they would often hear a much deeper voice respond to Jean. Now, some people say that, you know, oh, it could be simply Jean kind of putting on the voice of Robert, like in play, you know, which again is the perfectly typical thing for children to do, sure. But there was definitely some unease and trepidation about this, and things would then from then on continue to take a much darker turn. One night the family were woken to the sound of Jean screaming, and these were properly terrified, bone-chilling screams. So they ran up to his room to find out what was going on, and they found the room just in complete and utter disarray. Furniture was all upended and moved around, things were scattered across the floor. It was all just a complete and utter mess. And turning to their son, the authors found Jean curled up on top of his bed. He's crying, he's shaking, and he's just staring at Robert the doll, who sat on the end of his bed. And when his parents tried finding out what was going on, all Jean would say was, "Robert did it. Robert did it." And this would be a pattern that would become repeated over time. Whenever anything in a house went wrong, whenever anything got broken, it would always be the same. Robert did it. And in the end, Jean's parents ended up getting tired of this, and much to Jean's dismay, Robert was locked up in the attic, and that was expected to have been the end of it. Unfortunately for them, it wasn't. There was a lot of rumour and fear, almost, especially among the servants, and as a result there was quite a quick turnover of servants coming and going from the house because they were all just so afraid. Reportedly, a lot of people would hear things coming from the attic, such as footsteps and children's giggling, even when there weren't any children in the house. As I said, the turnover of servants was quite a quick thing because, you know, they were all absolutely terrified of the supposed goings on, and even visitors to the house who weren't, you know, servants, they all had the distinct feeling that there was something almost otherworldly about the house now, and quite often they would hear things that they couldn't quite explain. Now, over time, Jean grew up and ended up moving away to Paris to study painting. And although he was over there for quite a few years, he did return to the Otto family home in the end in 1945 to inherit the house once his mother had passed away. And one of the first things that he did when he moved back home was to go up to the attic and bring down Robert the doll again from all the years where he'd been stuck up there. In many ways, it felt like no time had passed at all, the two were totally inseparable again, and Jean even began referring to Robert in the first person as if he were a living, breathing being. And he would keep him in their old room and put him pride of place in the window so he could just simply watch the world go by. And the stories say that the neighbourhood children were incredibly afraid of Robert and the house, and in fact would find alternative routes to take to go to and from school so they didn't have to pass it, because apparently they would look up to the window where Robert was sat, and a second later Robert would be in a completely different window looking at them. And obviously this would be something that would absolutely terrify them, with probably good reason to, really. And so yeah, the children would avoid walking past the house as much as possible. Now, Jean didn't care about any of this. As far as he was concerned, everything was fine and normal. You know, he and Robert were together again, and that was all that mattered. His wife Annette wasn't so thrilled at this setup, and in fact she'd be reported to telling friends how concerned she was about this, especially considering the fact that Jean seemed to revert back to his childhood habit of blaming Robert whenever anything negative happened in the house. Now, there's no record of Annette ever experiencing any of the weird things that other people had reported on in regards to Robert, but we do know that she continued to hate him all the way up to Jean's death in 1974, and at that point she then locked Robert back up in the attic, and later that year actually sold the house to a Myrtle realtor. And now Myrtle, at the time of buying this house, obviously wasn't aware that she wasn't just now the owner of this beautiful new home, but she was also now the caretaker of Robert. She and other people who visited the house would often remark on odd things happening, such as hearing the footsteps and the child giggles. And it wasn't until she went up into the attic at one point and discovered Robert the doll up there and brought him down to the house that she hoped that that would help settle things. Unfortunately, that didn't happen so much. In fact, it seemed to only encourage him. And something that people would often remark on, especially if they talked ill of Jean Otto in Robert's presence, would be the fact that the expression on his face seemed to change into almost a scowl. And quite often they would find that they would see him in one room one moment and in a completely different room the next. Now, in the end, Robert would be donated to the Fort East Martello Museum in Key West, Florida. And at first, the museum staff were only too happy to have him. You know, this was a beautiful old childhood doll that they would only be too happy to put on display for people to see. But it wouldn't be long until strange things began happening at the museum. Quite often staff would hear footsteps in the museum after hours as they were closing up. they would often hear childlike giggles, and often they would find the lights would turn off and on of their own accord, and it wouldn't be too long before they too started the old line of Robert did it. So after a little while, in an attempt to stop the poltergeist-like activity, staff decided to gift Robert with a little stuffed dog, which you can still see with him to this day. And for a while this seemed to work and kind of placate him, but it didn't last for long, and soon after the activity started up again. As a result of this, staff at the museum ended up making a list of rules for people to follow whenever they went to visit Robert. The first one would be they would have to give some form of introduction to him upon first walking in to the room where he was. So they would have to give him their name and kind of express how happy or how excited they were to be able to meet him. The second one would be that they would have to ask his permission before they took any photos of him. It's kind of unknown as to how he would give his permission or not, but it's kind of believed that if the person asking felt any kind of like negativity around them, then that would usually be an indicator that no, not today kind of thing. There are some reports of cameras and phones kind of malfunctioning upon the people stepping into the room where Robert is, and then being completely normal again once they'd left. Some pictures have gone completely from people who have failed to ask his permission, and of course there are the more severe consequences in some cases, which we'll get to in a minute. And the third rule for guests would be, upon leaving the room where Robert was, to thank him for his time and if he had granted permission for the pictures. Now, as I mentioned before, there are some apparent more severe consequences for some people who fail to abide by these rules when visiting Robert, and these can be anything from, failing to introduce themselves properly upon first meeting him, to actively insulting him, or even insulting Jean or so around him. And these aren't just like isolated incidents either. To this day, Robert receives countless letters, all from people asking his forgiveness for some form of transgression that they've done whilst around him. And I find it quite unbelievable because, some of these letters were from people who, clearly didn't believe in his power and the stories around him. And then as soon as something negative happened, all of a sudden they have their eyes opened as to what if it was the curse of Robert? And the curse could be anything from, someone's car breaking down to more serious things like serious illnesses or accidents, and sometimes even resulting in people dying. Now, I don't know whether these things are just a coincidence, or there's something to it. I probably would kind of, although I do try to keep a rational mind, there are some things which I strongly believe we know very little about, and they deserve respect and caution when either talking about them or being around them. And I find it just absolutely incredible, frankly. Apparently Robert, like I said, gets all these letters. People also send in gifts for him. These can be anything from, you know, money and chocolates to, and even to things like marijuana, which the museum does not condone, and finds completely unacceptable, but there we go. Interestingly enough, these things aren't touched by the staff at the museum. They, I think, would rather err on the side of caution and just, you know, kind of leave them for Robert, which, to be honest, I think is rather wise, don't you? And yeah, apparently it's not just apology letters that Robert gets either. There are some people who actively write to him asking him to actively curse someone that they don't like, and, you know, kind of giving him the name and why they want that person cursed, etc., which is certainly one way of finding revenge, I suppose. So the question now remains, where did Robert's powers come from? After all, if these stories are true and are to be believed, they must come from somewhere, right? Well, I've done a little bit of digging and I found a rather interesting piece of history about the Otto family. Now, obviously back in those days, record keeping isn't what it is today, but I discovered that the Ottos were very close for a number of years with a black couple who were in their employ called William and Emmeline Abbott. Now, we know from records that William was a very close contact of Jean's grandfather. He was basically his eyes and ears, especially in his later years. He looked after him a great deal, and, you know, they had a very good bond. And when Jean's grandfather passed away, Jean's father continued to keep William on as someone to help out in the family pharmacy. Now, interestingly enough, the Abbotts, it seems, had actually been laid to rest after they passed on in the Otto family burial plot. Now, this at the time was like incredibly rare for interracial burial plots to be, you know, combined together. and it just kind of shows, you know, how close these two families apparently were. Now, we know William's role in the family, but it's kind of more unclear about what Emmeline's role was. However, there is some speculation that Jean's father was not exactly, shall we say, faithful to his wife, Jean's mother, and there's a distinct possibility that Emmeline could have well been one of his mistresses. Now, it's also rather interesting that Jean's mother, Minnie, actually opted out of being buried in the family burial plot upon her death, which, if the idea of her husband being sort of a womanizer is true, I can't really blame her, really, because who'd want to spend eternity with a philandering husband or indeed spouse? You know, it doesn't matter what gender you are, really. You know, it's just not something that anyone would want. Now, as I said before, record keeping wasn't as strict as it is today, but apparently records, or what few records there are, show that Emmeline, between the years of 1900 to 1910, somewhere in that time, she had actually lost a child. Now, whether that was a child in which she had with her husband, or, as could be believed or speculated by the father of Jean, I'm just kind of putting it out there. If that had been the case, obviously Jean received Robert in about 1904. So my question is, could what Robert has become, shall we say, have had anything to do with that? After all, it could have been a child choosing to inhabit this doll as a way of keeping close to her family that she had had when she was alive. I mean, it would certainly explain why she and Jean had been so close, because they would have been, you know, half siblings. On the other hand, could it have been a grieving mother wishing to enact some form of revenge against the family? After all, she must have found it incredibly hard knowing that her child passed away while seeing, you know, the potential father of this child then continuing to go about his life with his wife and the children who he had with her. There are stories that the nanny who had been looking after Robert knew voodoo, and the reason why she had been dismissed from the family home was when Minnie had one day caught her doing some form of voodoo ritual out in a garden. Obviously, again, we can never know for sure, I don't believe, but if this is the case, that suddenly ties into, you know, some of the story that people have told about Robert and his origin. Could Emmeline have in fact been the person to have given Robert away to Jean, fully knowing that there was something embodying Robert which would have caused the rest of the family, you know, upset and possibly even harm? We don't know, but all we know is that the story of Robert the Doll is an interesting one, and if you ever get a chance to go and visit him, just be sure to err on the side of caution and keep in mind that he may not be all he first appears. Until next time, take care and sweet dreams.